not? Well, if you've been with us on Wednesday night, we're working our way through the book of 1 Corinthians. We're going to be in chapter 7 tonight, if you want to find your place there. So 1 Corinthians has had a lot of difficult topics of conversation so far. We've talked about factions in the church. We've talked about church discipline. We've talked about sexual immorality. We have talked about lawsuits. And tonight we're going to talk about marriage, divorce, and biblical sexuality. And so I told Lisa, I said, all of this stuff, and we hadn't even got to the part where it talks about speaking in tongues or women covering their head. You know, so we've had some pointed topics of conversation, and tonight I think will be no different. So just kind of to back up and kind of recap. Paul writes the letter of 1 Corinthians to the church at Corinth, partly in response to a report that he's heard about the church, but also partly in response to a letter that they apparently wrote to him. And in this letter, they had several questions that they were asking about different topics or things that were going on in the church. So tonight, he is going to address this topic of that they wrote in the letter that about marriage. So here's kind of, if it's difficult to know exactly the question that they ask because we don't have the letter that they wrote to him. We have the letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. We don't have the letter that the Corinthians wrote to Paul. So we just kind of have to judge it based off of context. But apparently, based on the response that Paul gives, you had one group in the church that was involved in sexual immorality. And we kind of talked about that last time. Even the gross sexual immorality of a man having relations with his stepmother. And sexual immorality was rampant in Corinth, and it had bled into the church. But then apparently you have this whole other group in the church that takes it all the way to the other extreme and says sex is inherently bad, sex is evil, and so it should be shunned. If you really want to be holy, if you really want to be as close to God as you can possibly be, then you should abstain from sex altogether, and even to the point that you shouldn't get married. Like if you're single, you shouldn't get married, and if you are married, then really, if you really want to do what Jesus is wanting you to do, that you shouldn't have sex even if you're married. And so they apparently write to ask this question: what is good? What is right? Is it good to be single? Is it good to marry? And if we do marry, what's that relationship supposed to look like, particularly when it has to do with sexual immorality? Is sex immoral always, or just under certain circumstances? And so Paul is going to address all of that in chapter 7. We're only going to look at part of the chapter tonight because we just literally don't have time to talk about the whole chapter. So tonight is going to be focused more on marriage, divorce, and biblical sexuality. Next week will be more on the idea of singleness. We're going to talk about these. These are uncomfortable topics to talk about in some ways, but we're going to talk about them because the Bible talks about them, and we're not going to talk about them to quite the level of detail that if we were doing like a marriage seminar, which I think would be really cool to do, by the way, but this is not a marriage seminar. So we're not going to get in it to quite that depth, but we're going to talk about it as it pertains to the text here. So all that being said, let's dig in. I'm in verse 1 of chapter 7. Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, see, he's answering that letter. Considering the things that you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. And the idea there seems to be not to get married. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. Affection may be a weak translation of that. It's more has to do with physical intimacy is the idea there. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But I say this as a concession, not as a command, for I wish that all men were even as myself, but each one has his own gift. Now, when he says, I wish that each man was as myself, what does he mean there? Single, yeah, not married. I wish that all men were even as myself, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it's good for them if they remain even as I am, in other words, single. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. And I think that is the idea there, is burn with passion. I think some of the King James, some of maybe the older translation just say to burn. Well, that's kind of confusing because that sounds like, well, if I get married, I'm going to burn in hell. That's not the idea. He's saying it's better to get married than to burn with passion. So that's the idea. All right, a lot to talk about, a lot to unpackage here. So they asked the question of Paul, what should we do? Should we stay single? Should we get married? What do you think? What's the right thing, Paul, for us to do? And he says, I think it's good for a man not to get married, not to touch a woman, the idea being not to get married. But he goes on to say, because of sexual immorality, let a man have his wife and each woman her own husband. So in other words, he's saying that, yes, if you can control yourself, being single is good because it gives you more opportunity to serve the Lord. You're not bound with the responsibilities of taking care of a wife and a family. If you can do that without lustful thoughts or desires in that regard, that's better. So, true or false, marriage is held as the ideal for Christians. That's false. Actually, Paul would argue that singleness is the ideal if one can avoid sexual temptation. Now, here's the thing. Paul said, I wish that all men were just like me. In other words, not married and don't want to be. Don't care. I can control my sexual desires. Not that he's. I'm trying to pick my words. He's not saying I don't like girls. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that I have the discipline that God has given me to control my urges to the point that I don't need to be married. And by being single, that frees me up to follow the call of God more fully. Are there some people that have that gift from God? Sure there are. I would say not many. My experience has been not many. That you can be single, particularly as a young person, and not care. Some people have it. not many. So what is Paul really saying? He who marries is doing well. He who's single and can control his urges is doing better. But if you're not that person, don't think that you're somehow failing spiritually, because number one, it's a gift from God, and number two, very few people have it. So I gave you a little multiple choice thing. I want you to circle the best answer. There are more than one possible answer, but circle the best answer here. So let's see, what about the first one? Singleness is a gift. That is true. That is true. So I got to tell this story. so I'm in seminary. It's before Lisa and I met, but not too long. Maybe 6 months before we met. Not a long time. And I had asked this girl in one of my classes if she'd like to go out. And she said sure. So we went out a couple of times. Nothing serious. We weren't in a relationship. We'd gone out a couple of times. Gone out to dinner, I don't remember, a couple of dates. And I think it was after the second date that she's looking, we're having dinner, and she says, "Mark, I need to tell you something." I'm like, okay, what do you want to tell me? She says, "I have the gift. I think you ought to know I have the gift." I'm like, what gift? I'm like, what are you talking about? I have the gift. The gift of being single. I'm like, okay. She's like, "Well, I just wanted you to know that I'm not interested in anything romantic with you." I'm like, okay. She's like, she said, I like you, you're a nice guy and all, but I don't want anything romantic. I have the gift. God has given me the gift of being single. Now, if you want to take me out to dinner and to Six Flags, I'm fine with that. But I just want you to know there's no romance. I don't remember exactly what I said. I was polite. I wasn't a jerk, but, not intentionally anyway. I don't know. But anyway, I never asked her out again, because here's the thing. Okay, she has the gift. Here's the thing. I don't know if she really had the gift, or she just. I don't know if she meant I have the gift of being single, or I'd rather not marry anybody than to marry you. I think that might have been the idea there. I don't know, but she's. But I didn't. I figured that as tight as money was when I was in seminary, she could buy her own dinner and ticket to Six Flags. I didn't ask her out again. It wasn't long after that I met Lisa, and she didn't have the gift of being single, so it all worked out good. So it's a pity, a pity date that turned into a pity marriage. I guess that's all right. Whatever works. Yeah. So singleness is a gift. Marriage is a gift. That's true too. And Paul says some have one gift, some have another. So is marriage a gift? I don't know how I could look at what God has given me and not say marriage is a gift. So Paul said his singleness is a gift. I say my marriage is a gift. So yes. C, singleness is a curse. This was the running joke at seminary, like for all us single guys. It's like, Paul said singleness is a gift, but it's a curse. But it was all said in jest. But no, Paul wouldn't say no. Singleness is not a curse. Marriage is a curse. I've heard some married men that would say that, but I think Paul would argue to the contrary. Or E, both marriage and singleness should be seen as a gift. E is the correct answer there. All right. Now, Paul talks quite a bit in these verses about sex in marriage and about how that a husband and wife should have sex, and they should have sex. They shouldn't deprive one another of that right. It's the wording that he uses is really interesting. Literally, he says, "Don't rob one another." In other words, that the husband. Let me. this is going to sound like in our society, it's going to sound so bad to our ears, but like the husband has the right of his wife's body, and the wife has the right to her husband's body. And so if you're depriving one another of that sexual intimacy, then you're actually robbing them of the other person of their right. So he's saying, don't do that. So, and he actually argues, Paul argues that biblical sexuality, God ordained sex between a man and his wife, is actually would lead to a more godly life. So they ask the question, hey, if we want to have a more godly life, should we abstain from sex? Paul says, on the contrary, a biblical marriage, biblical sex in marriage actually leads to a more godly life. Now, what are some reasons that he gives as to why biblical sexuality would actually lead to a more godly lifestyle or more godly life? Yeah, right. So it's a safeguard against sexual immorality. That's one thing he says. That's one of the things that he's addressing in chapter 6 is the problem in Corinth and apparently in the church of sexual immorality. He said, look, get married and have sex with your spouse. And that way, that will curb those sexual appetites where you won't be tempted to engage in sexual immorality. So that's one. Somebody over here said something. Right. So that's kind of the same idea. It's a safeguard against sexual immorality. Secondly, it promotes selflessness and self-sacrifice. Because the world's idea of sex is it's all about me and my pleasure and my wants and my needs. But biblical sexuality is all about pleasing the other person. And so it is selflessness and self-sacrifice is the biblical idea of sexuality. So, which is the gospel way. It's what we as Christians are supposed to do to everyone. We're supposed to be selfless and self-sacrificing to everyone. Well, this is done in a very in a microcosm of marriage by way of sex. It's one of the ways it's done, that you are demonstrating selflessness and self-sacrifice. And then finally, oneness in biblical sexuality becomes a picture of Christ in the church. So, and Jesus talks about this. He goes back to Genesis language, creation language, and he says, speaking of the husband and wife, the man shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So in marriage, and then he uses that language, and Paul uses that language elsewhere in the New Testament of Christ in the church, that we as the bride of Christ are one with Christ. And so biblical marriage becomes a picture of the church's relationship with Christ. And particularly this idea of oneness, one flesh with Christ, being one with Christ. And how does a married couple most clearly paint the picture of being one? Through biblical married sexuality. So now, most couples probably don't go to the bedroom and think, we're going to paint a picture of Jesus in the church tonight. But the reality is that for believing married couples, it's a beautiful thing. And it's not an ugly thing, it's not an evil thing, it's a beautiful thing, and it paints a picture of Christ and the church. So Questions on, don't ask me questions on sex. Let's just move along, all right? Well, I'm just teasing. If you have a question on the verses, ask me. What's the only exception that Paul gives as to why a married couple would abstain from sex? Mutual agreement for the purpose of prayer and fasting. So Paul said the only time that a couple shouldn't be having sex is if they mutually agree on a given period of time where we're going to abstain from sex and we're going to pray, we're going to fast, we're going to seek the Lord only for a time, and then you come back together, because if you don't, what might happen? You might get tempted to fall into sexual immorality. Okay, now here, so I was reading, I read several different commentaries on, and I'm working with several different commentaries through, as we work through Corinthians. One of the commentaries made this statement and then explained it. And I thought, man, that makes a lot of sense. I agree with that. But he made this statement that sex must be viewed as ordinary. Now, anybody want to take a stab as to what he means by that? Sex must be viewed as ordinary. Huh? It's part of life, but it's not all of life. That's kind of where he was going with that. This is what he said. So in our society today, and probably in society for all times, people tend to gravitate towards one of two extremes when it comes to sex. You have those that see sex as abnormal. And unfortunately, a lot of times those folks are religious folks that are misguided. They don't understand the biblical teaching on sex. But sex is seen as something abnormal, that it is, it's evil, it's bad, it's wrong, that if you're really serving the Lord the way you ought to, then you wouldn't have sex. You wouldn't want sex, you wouldn't have sex. And really, even a married couple, like, maybe you get an excuse to have children, but then after that, if you're really serving Jesus, you shouldn't even want it, much less have it. But he would say, no, it's ordinary, it's normal. It's a normal part of life, married life. When a married couple has sex, that's ordinary, that's normal. What would be abnormal, not ordinary, is for a couple who are in otherwise good health not to be having sex. That indicates a problem in the relationship. Couples, I've done a lot of marriage counseling over the last 28 years. I found that most married couples fight over one of two things: money and sex. That's it. I mean, you can boil most marriage problems down to two things: money and sex. Usually the lack of them, the lack or one or both of them. But it's normal. Sex is normal for a married couple, so it's ordinary. But it's not. Then you got a whole nother sector of people that wants to paint sex as something extraordinary. That it is the ultimate experience that you can experience. That the greatest pleasure of life, the greatest fulfillment of life comes through sexuality, it comes through sex. Well, that's not the biblical teaching either. What is the ultimate fulfillment in life? Jesus. What is the ultimate pleasure in life? Knowing Him. So, sex is ordinary. It's an ordinary part of life, but it's not all of life. It's not abnormal, it's not evil, it's not wrong, it's ordinary. But it's not extraordinary. It's not the ultimate expression and experience in life. It's just ordinary. So, I don't know. I don't know if you want to go home and and say, romance your spouse by saying, honey, let's have ordinary sex tonight. I don't know. But ordinary. Okay, I'm going to be careful or I'm going to go off the cliff, and I don't want to do that. Questions on those verses? I don't know. Hey, it's all right here. Paul's talking. I'm just reading what Paul says here. That's all I'm doing. All right. Yeah. Yeah. Paul made me do it. That's right. All right. Let's look on then to a topic that's probably no more fun to discuss, and that's divorce. And particularly, he's talking here about a situation where if you get let's say you're lost and your spouse is lost. You're married, and both you and your spouse are lost, and you come to know Jesus, but your spouse is still an unbeliever. This is apparently a question that's wrapped up in their other question about should we marry or not. What should I do? Should I stay married to him? Should I divorce him? Should I divorce him and marry a believer? What should I do? So Paul is going to address that in verse 10. Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, a wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and a husband is not to divorce his wife. So here he's very clear, and he's echoing what Jesus has said about divorce as well in the Gospels, that if you're married, you're not to divorce. You're supposed to stay married to that person, and if you do get divorced, you're supposed to either live as a single person, or be reconciled to your husband. So I mean that or your spouse. He's speaking in terms of the wife, but it would apply either way there. Verse 13, a woman who has a husband who does not believe, in other words, is not a Christian, if he's willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. Now, he's not talking about if you're a believer and you go out and you marry a lost person willingly. That's forbidden in Scripture. That we're not to marry, a believer is not to marry an unbeliever. But he's talking about what if you're both unbelievers and one of you gets saved, what should you do? And he says that if the husband is willing, if the spouse is willing, then live with him. Don't divorce him. For the unbelieving 14, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband, otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they're holy. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. That's kind of a confusing verse. If the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? And the idea is by your testimony. And many's the time I've seen that an unbelieving spouse would come to Christ because of the witness and the testimony and the influence of the believing spouse. So I've seen that play itself out. So it's a very strict view. The Bible has a very strict view of divorce, more so than anything you will find in the secular world. The secular world says, try marriage, and if you don't like it, then you can always get divorced. But the Bible has a very strict view of divorce, and it comes from its high view of marriage. You can't really have a high view of marriage and not have a strict view of divorce. Because to the world, a marriage is just a convenient arrangement as long as both parties' needs are being met. But the biblical view of marriage is it is a lifetime commitment, and it is a picture of Christ in the church. Well, when should I give up on my husband? Well, I don't know. Let's see. Your marriage is supposed to be a picture of Christ in the church. Well, he's not do you want Jesus, at what point do you want Jesus to give up on you? Oh, that's different. Well, shouldn't be, We want all the grace and mercy from Jesus, and we won't, play by the rules for everybody else. It's a strict view of divorce because it's a high view of marriage. Now, there's this idea that everybody's out there looking for Mr. Right or Miss Right. I'm looking for Mr. Right, Miss Right. What's the problem with that? There was only one Mr. Right that ever lived, and his name was Jesus. And he married, Miss Wrong, the church. Like we're not, the church is not Miss Right. We are not like the perfect spouse to Jesus. So this idea of expecting another human being to somehow meet all your qualifications, meet all your needs, that your ultimate fulfillment would come through this other person, this husband, this wife. No spouse can possibly meet all of your needs. So the problem with expecting marriage to bring you ultimate fulfillment is that no spouse can possibly meet all of your needs. And ultimate fulfillment can only be found where? In Jesus Christ. So if you're looking for another human being to give you fulfillment, it cannot be. That's why people switch partners so much. I'm with this guy, I'm with that guy, I'm with that guy, I'm with this girl, I'm with this girl, I'm with this girl. Why? I mean, constantly hopping around relationships. Why? Because we're always looking for that person that will fulfill ultimately all of my needs. You're never going to find them. So you're constantly going to be hopping from one relationship to another, looking for that when it can only be found through Jesus Christ. When you enter a relationship, a marriage relationship, you cannot be looking for how is this person going to meet my needs. That's not what biblical marriage is. Biblical marriage is what is this person's need and how can I meet them? What can I do to meet this person's needs, knowing that I will not be able to meet all of those needs and I will not be able to succeed on that 100%. But what can I do to give them husbands, we're to love our wives as Christ loved the church. That's a tall order, and gave himself for her. So it's about meeting the other person's needs. That's the idea there. So, how should a believer approach this idea of feeling like they're married to the wrong person? Marriage case and marriage counseling. So, I mean, in context, he's kind of talking about, if you're married to an unbeliever kind of deal. But I mean, the discussion can broaden to, because sometimes people think that, we were young when we got married and we didn't know what we were doing. We weren't meant for each other. We weren't compatible. But now we've grown up, and I've grown up, and I know now that I had married the wrong person, but I found the right person now, and so I'm going to divorce this person that I'm married to because they're the wrong person and go marry Mr. Right over here. All right. Remember, marriage is a picture of the gospel. Marriage is a picture of the gospel. The only Mr. Right is Jesus, and he loved and sacrificed himself for an imperfect church. Is your husband going to be the perfect husband? No. I'll just tell you right now, he won't. One of the things that I tell couples in marriage, premarital counseling. When they come to me, I require 2 sessions of premarital counseling before I do any weddings. And when they come to me, one of the things that I do, I sit them down in my office and I say, I want you to look at him. I want you to look at her. And I want you to decide right now if you can live the rest of your life with that person just the way they are right now. And if you can't, then for goodness sake, don't get married. Because this idea that, I'll marry this poor old slob and I'll make him into the husband he's supposed to be. No, you won't. What is the saying that women marry a husband thinking they can change him, and men marry a wife hoping she never changes, and neither one of those are true. Neither one of those fantasies come true. You're not going to change that person. God may change them, but you're not going to change them. So, you married to Mr. Wrong? Well, join the club. Everybody's married to Mr. Wrong. Everybody's married to Mrs. Wrong. Because we're imperfect people. And that's what the gospel is all about. It's not about finding the perfect person to meet all my needs. It's me pouring myself into this imperfect person to demonstrate love and grace and mercy to an imperfect person because I'm an imperfect person as well. Now, 14 is it's a difficult verse to understand. And he's talking here about a couple who's, you've got like one of the basically the illustration he's using is the wife is a believer, the husband is an unbeliever. Should you get divorced or not? And he says, no, stay with them. If they aren't willing to stay with you, stay with them. Because he says that the husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the believing husband. In other words, the idea seems to be sanctified in the sense of holy, is consecrated. That even in spite that your marriage is sacred because you are a believer. That here was the concern of the Corinthians, that if I'm a believer and I'm now one with an unbeliever, does that somehow defile me? I mean, because he's already said in chapter 6, don't go have sexual relations with a prostitute because you become one with them, and you're a believer. You're not supposed to become one with an unbeliever. Okay, but when you're married, he says, no, don't divorce them. He says your marriage is sanctified because you're the believer. So in other words, it's not that the marriage becomes unholy because he's an unbeliever, but rather the marriage is holy because you are a believer. And then he talks about your children would be clean somehow or another, and it's very difficult to try to understand exactly what Paul is saying here. But somehow or another, the idea seems to be that your family is under the blessing of God because you are a believer, even though your husband may not be, your kids, your kids will get godly influence, your husband will get godly influence if you stay with them. Seems to be the idea. Questions on that? There's different ways of interpreting that, but that's the best I could get at it. All right. Let's move on to verse 17 then. But God has distributed to each one as the Lord has called. Each one's, let me do this. But as the Lord has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. That's Paul kind of uses some difficult language there. But basically what he's saying is, however you are, whatever state you're in, when God calls you to be a believer, then be content with that. So I ordain in all the churches. Was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Was anyone called While uncircumcised, let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. Let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it, but if you can be made free, rather use it. In other words, use the opportunity to do that. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, let each one remain with God in the state in which he was called. So, basically, he's saying that be content with whatever state God has you in right now. Like, don't always be looking to try to have some different station in life. You know, and I mean, this is a lesson that God had to beat through my hard-headed skull along the way. I mean, I look back, a whole lot of my life was, I feel like, almost wasted because I was always focused on what was next, you know. Yeah, I'm in seminary, but I'm going to be at the church. Yeah, I'm single now, but I'm going to be married one day. Or, yeah, I'm at this church, but one of these days I'm going to be at a better church. And I mean, I felt like, looking back, a lot of my life I wasted, never really taking the opportunity to really enjoy the blessings of where God had me right then. So how should believers approach their current life situation? Be content with where God has you right now. Or as the little bumper stickers say, bloom where you're planted. I think that's the idea. Now, he would go on to say, and he uses several illustrations. He uses circumcision and uncircumcision. In other words, were you a Gentile? Don't try to be a Jew. Were you a Jew? Don't try to be a Gentile. Were you married? Then don't wish you were single. Were you single? Then don't worry about not being married. Were you a slave? Don't worry about it. Now, if you have an opportunity to be free, take that opportunity. In other words, if you have an opportunity, if God presents the opportunity to better your situation, take the opportunity. God's given it to you. But don't obsess over that. Don't waste your life where you are, what you're doing, always trying to get to that next thing. Take the opportunity. So how does Paul's discussion on life situation in these verses tie into the broader discussion of marriage? Well, kind of, the same thing. Be content in the marriage situation that God has you in right now. If you're single, you may not want to be single, but find the blessings that God has for you in that right now. Are you married? Then enjoy marriage is a blessing. Even though, there may be times, you wake up in the morning and you look over and your spouse doesn't seem like a blessing to you, but marriage is a blessing. So take advantage of the blessings that you have. I got to tell this story. Seminary was I was 26 years old before Lisa and I met, and most of the girls I dated, it turned out kind of like the girl that you can take me to Six Flags and to dinner, but I don't want any romance. I had one blind date where a girl took one look at me, then looked past me and saw my Mustang sitting in the driveway, and her response was, "Well, at least you have a nice car." So and I was like, "Oh, what?" And I can remember just laying in bed at night saying, "God, what's wrong with me? I don't understand. Like, I know men that are uglier and stupider than me, and they get married. Why? What's wrong with me that I can't find anybody?" And it bothered me for a long time. And then I was preaching a revival during spring break, my third year at seminary. I took a class on revival. They sent me to Iowa to preach this revival in this little church. And they put me up in this little hotel room, kind of like the no-tell motel room kind of thing, So I'm sitting just me in my hotel room. And I can distinctly remember, like, on my face, on the floor, nasty carpet. I don't know what all was done on that carpet. I was face first on it. just crying before the Lord. And I said, God, I will follow you no matter what. If you want to give me a wife, that's fine. If you don't want to give me a wife, that's fine. I'm still going to follow you. I'm with your help, I'm going to quit worrying about it. I said, there's two things I asked. First of all, take the desire to be married away. If you don't want me to be married, that's fine, but I want to be married real bad. So if you don't want me to get married, then take the desire to be married away. And also, you've called me to preach, and I don't know very many churches that want to hire a single man that's not married. So if you don't want me to get married, that's fine. Take the desire away and just give me a church where it's okay that they don't care that I'm single. But I'm giving it to you. That was probably like, what day did we meet? So that was probably like Monday night, and Thursday I met Lisa. She was there God had it all worked out. But he wasn't finished. He did not have me in a point in my life where I was ready for her. I first had to give it all up and say, God, you're what's most important. You're all that matters. Nothing matters but you. And God said, well, I'm glad we finally got that established here. Here's what you've been waiting on. Here's what you've been waiting on this whole time. So, but I look back at all the potential times of blessing that I missed those first 26 years, worrying about something that God already had solved. So anyway, that's that. Questions on those verses? I give you a couple little application questions. We're kind of running short on time, so we're just going to come through them kind of quickly. 5 principles of marriage that we find in Paul's teaching. I'm just going to kind of give you these. These are what I kind of pulled out of this. Number 1, love is a choice, and I think that's important. Love is a choice. You can choose to love someone or choose not to. Number 2, it's wrong to look to a spouse, any spouse, to meet all of your needs because only Jesus can do that. It's wrong to look to a spouse to meet all your needs because only Jesus can do that. Number 3, oneness must touch every aspect of your life. I mean, you have to be one, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. I always worry about these couples that, well, she has her checking account and I have my checking account. And, we're not on the same page. He wants to take the check and blow it on a new tractor, but she's saving for Hawaii. And I knew I had a couple one time in one of my churches that she was saving money so she could quit work and be a stay-at-home mom with their kids. And he took their savings and bought a quarter horse and a trailer to pull it in. So needless to say, there was problems there. Number 4, oneness in marriage must begin with oneness in faith. How can you be one with someone when you don't even agree on the most important thing in your life, which is Jesus as Lord? And number 5, ultimately, marriage is not about the benefits you receive, but the commitments that you make as Christ commits himself to the church. Marriage is it's not about the benefits you receive, but the commitments that you make as Christ commits himself to the church. Do I need to repeat any of that, or you got it? Number 5, slowly, number 5. Ultimately, marriage is not about the benefits you receive, but the commitments you make as Christ commits himself to the church. All right. Number 5. Ultimately, marriage is not about the benefits you receive. That's the first part. It's about the commitments you make as Christ commits himself to the church. In other words, that is the picture that we paint. All right, so So have I given you all my Brother Mark's rules for romance? Let me give you my rules for romance. Nobody ever listens to me, but if you will, it will provide, great peace in marriage and relationships. Number one, don't date anybody that you wouldn't marry. Number two, don't marry anybody that doesn't love Jesus as much as you do. If you'll follow those rules, you'll be happy. All right, what do we got? Let's see. Oh, yeah, Pastor Tobias. I try really hard to come up with names that aren't connected in the church in any way. So Pastor Tobias has instructed his congregation, every Christian should get married. It is the relationship on which Jesus modeled his relationship to the church. Now critique Pastor Tobias's theology on this matter. Yeah, I mean, Paul clearly argues that marriage is for some, but not for all. So here's the thing. It's not that Christ in the church is a picture of marriage. It's that marriage is a picture of Christ in the church. Christ in the church is the reality. It would be like saying, well, I don't really need Lisa as my wife because I got a picture of her and that's just as good. Well, no, the picture is just a picture. Lisa is the reality. So marriage is the picture. Christ in the church is the reality. Also, there are other pictures of our relationship to Christ, our relationship to God. I mean, Scripture talks about us being the children of God. Does that mean that every couple should have children? I mean, I don't think that's what it means. It speaks of us being soldiers of God. Does that mean everybody should go out and join the army? No, I don't think that's what it means. I think Pastor Tobias is off there. All right, here's the last one. Sister Alice is married to Albert, who is not a Christian. Alice and Albert married before Alice got saved. Now that Alice is a believer, she plans on divorcing Albert and marrying a preacher so she can better serve the Lord. What's wrong with this approach? Well, first of all, we might say that I might say this. Preachers don't necessarily make better husbands than anybody else. I think Lisa would probably amen that. Preachers are just guys just like anybody else. They're not necessarily going to, just holding the office of pastor or preacher necessarily make you a better spouse. In fact, it's actually a really hard road to be a pastor's wife. It's not a life for everyone. Secondly, I would say this: marriage won't make you more holy. Being married to a preacher is not going to make you any more holy than being married to Albert. And here's the thing: you're now one with this person, Albert. Alice and Albert are one. Whether Alice divorces Albert or not, she's still one with him. Like Alice and Albert are married. Alice and Albert are one. Alice can divorce Albert and go marry somebody else, but she's still one. Like you don't get oh, well, we'll just get the big eraser and erase it out and it'll all be gone. No, I mean, it doesn't work that way. And finally, I would say this. Any preacher that would be a part of that relationship that came about in that way wouldn't be worth marrying anyway. You wouldn't want that guy. Tobias might, yeah. Maybe Alice and Tobias could hook up. Maybe that'd be a good match there. I don't know. All right, well, about all we have time to say on a very difficult subject. But I mean, I think we need to talk about it every once in a while. Why don't we talk about it in church? The Bible talks about it, and we ought to talk about it, right? Questions or comments? All right, let's close in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for your word, how you do continue to speak through it. Lord, I pray that you would help us, Lord, to put your word into practice in our lives, in our church, Lord. I pray that you'd bless us and bring us back on Sunday ready to worship you. And we pray in the name of Jesus. Amen.